Hello, everyone, and welcome to this
It's
live
actually
episode.
oh,
Oh, no, it's fine. Did you want to introduce the episode? Anyway, in lay terms, I'm Payman Ascari. I'm here with Marty Up North. How's it going?
good. Yeah, we're not professionals, right? We're not the CBC with the $1.6 billion budgets to dazzle our yeah, let's not go there. Let's not go
On the plus side, at least we don't get paid to lie. We just don't get paid, period.
period. Yeah.
Uh,
Actually, I make a few bucks these days on I make a few bucks on YouTube and a few bucks on Twitter, right? It's kind of nice to get it pays for the membership.
yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way to monetize this because right now I'm losing so much money from this podcast.
Yeah. Wow. Oh
Uh,
well. We got to do what we got to do.
Anyway,
So, what
on
are we
that
talking
note,
about today?
I think I wanted to get you to come on to talk about the Canada pension plan. So I'm gonna let you take it away. I'm gonna bring up the first slide. But if you could just, for those in the audience that like me are somewhat dim-witted, like just give me a simple explanation of what the Canada pension plan is.
First of all, don't feel bad because it's actually don't put that chart up just yet. You know, the Canada pension plan is very complicated to understand. And I'm not it's probably it's a timely topic for maybe for BC and others, but in Alberta it was an extremely timely topic because here in Alberta, and BC sort of in the same situation. We feel that we're not getting a fair shake out of Confederation, right? Like we're late to the party, and we're not getting a fair shake. And one of the things that was suggested in Alberta, like 20 years ago, by Stephen Harper and others, they talked about something called a firewall to protect ourselves from the overreach of Ottawa, and so, and in that protection, they talked about, Alberta should have its own pension plan like Quebec does. Alberta should have its own police force, its own tax collection agencies, and things like that. And then we forgot that talk. But then in the last 3-4 years with COVID and everything else, that the whole concept of a firewall reappeared in Alberta. And then with the election of Danielle Smith, it became front and center. So we started talking about all those things, but the Alberta pension plan is something we really started talking about, getting out of the Canada pension plan and starting our own. So then I got really interested in the Canada pension plan and how it works. And to be honest, I've been looking at it for almost 2 years. And during those 2 years, I keep learning about it. Like that's how complicated it is. And the other thing I realized is it's so complicated that most politicians who talk about it and most journalists who talk about it get it all wrong. Like they get it all wrong. So that's why I'm kind of happy that you're interested in this topic. Just like last week or 2 weeks ago, you're interested in the GDP. But these are things that politicians love to throw around, but they have no idea what they're talking about. So let's dive into it, right? Most Canadians, so the Canada pension plan started in 1966, and it was a John Diefenbaker idea, and other countries around the world were thinking of doing the same thing. Like the idea of a pension in the 1960s, and it started a little bit earlier in the US. The idea was to retire people and make room for new workers, right? Because if you remember in the 1960s, that's when the kids born in the 1940, at the end of World War II, the baby boomers, they're becoming adults, right? In the late 60s, they're starting to become adults. They're entering the workforce, and there's a whole ton of them, but there's also a whole ton of workers currently working. So in the US and in Canada, the governments had this idea of let's make people stop working. And how do we, but back in those days, you worked yourself to death, right? So the government said, let's force people out of work, and the way we'll do it is we'll pay them. We'll give them a pension. So the idea of a pension prior to, like in the 1940s, 1930s, that didn't exist, right? No, but you worked to death. So in the 1960s in North America, because of the baby boom, the government said we'll force workers to retire, and the way we'll do it is we'll pay them to retire. So the Canada pension plan in the 1960s was set up, and in those days it was quite simple. It was once you were 65, you got paid money. And who paid the workers that were retiring? It was the workers that were the workers, right? The workers. And then back in those days, there was no shortage of workers. For every person who was going to retire and get a pension in 1965, 66, 67, there was like 5 workers. So it was pretty simple. You collected a small amount of money from 5 workers and you gave it to a pensioner. And so the system, that's how the system was set up in the 1960s. So if you go to bring up one of the charts, bring up the numerical chart, not that one, not one of the numerical charts that I provided. Yeah, that one there, and expand on there you go, bingo. So that chart shows how the Canada Pension Plan was working in the 1970s, like in the very early years. So you see, you got a column there, 1979. A worker back in those days. Okay, so and everything about the Canada Pension Plan was always based on averages, right? Averages. So the average salary of a worker in those days was about $10,060. So, and any worker who made up to $10,060 or $10,600 paid 1.8% of their wages to the Canada Pension Plan. The government administered it, which amounted to about $190 or $191 for a worker. And then every worker, their employer would also match. So if you do the math, a worker making $10,600, 5 workers making $10,600, each paid about $200, right? $190. So that's $1,000. Double that because of their employers, which gets you to about $2,500. Mathematically, it gets you to a quarter. And so the pension that people were paid in those days was a quarter of the average salary. That's how the whole system was designed to work. So the average worker made $10,600 a year, and it took 5 workers to pay just $2,500 that was paid to one retiree, one pensioner. That's how the system worked. And so and that kind of system is called an earning related system, because the worker is not actually paying a pension that goes into a fund for himself in the future. It's never worked like that in Canada. The current workers are funding today's retirees. Because you hear that a lot of times, right? Like, keep your hands off my pension. Politicians say that, like, keep your hands off my pension. Workers say that because there's this conception this idea that you're putting money aside for yourself in the future. Not the case. Never been the case. Never will be the case. Question so far? Does this make sense? Or
it does. So my first question, you mentioned the baby boomers in the 60s.
Yep.
So
baby boomers are people that were born from 1946 until 1965, right?
Okay,
baby boomers are the children of people who came back from World War II.
And the purpose of the pension originally was to get the people that, like, the World War II generation to retire, so the boomers could come in.
Exactly, because the kids, my in-laws are examples of that. So my father-in-law was born in 1946, right after the war, right? From his dad came back from the war. My father-in-law was born in 1946. My father-in-law becomes an adult 18 years later in 1967. And there's a whole ton of them. So my father-in-law, as a baby boomer, as the front end of the baby boomer, they're hitting the workforce in huge numbers in the 1960s. And there's jobs, but there's so many workers coming behind that the government's like, we gotta make room for these workers. So they literally forced the people who had been working, who were at that point 65 years old, approaching my father-in-law's parents, they made them retire. With at one incentive for retiring was the Canada Pension Plan. Of course, there was other things, that's why the system was set up. And then if you look at the numbers, like, it doesn't look big, right? So in 1965, your pension was about 25% of what you were earning at the time. So 1 minute you're earning 11,600, and the next year the government says, well, you might as well retire, and here's $2,500 to retire. And it doesn't sound like much, but in those days, think about it, right? So you're 65 in those days. Your life expectancy of a Canadian in 1965 was 73, 74 years old. Like, so at retiring at 65, you're only going to live for another 4 or 5 years. And Canadians in that era, my father-in-law, my great-grandparents, let's say, they lived modestly, right? They lived across Canada. They had small houses, lower expectations. I mean, what did you do in 1965 by the time you were 70 years old? You weren't traveling around the world. Air travel was in its infancy. You weren't buying all sorts of luxuries. You had probably bought yourself a small house that you had succeeded in paying off. You lived modestly, Walmart didn't exist. You had a corner grocery store. I mean, life was really, really simple in 1965. So asking people to retire on a quarter of what they had previously earned was doable because, just because, right? That's the lifestyle they live. So the system as set up in the 1960s worked fine all the way through. And you can see all the way through on that chart up until 1979, the contribution of a worker was 1.8% of his salary, up to the maximum, up to the average salary, and it worked. And we had 4 to 5 workers for every person retiring for a long time because of the baby boom. I mean, there's so many workers in those days. So,
can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
How's this for characterizing it? The government brokered a deal. He went to the boomers and said, we will get you work. We will convince the businesses to match your 1.8%, and we'll convince your parents to retire, provided that you take a hit on your salary. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's it. And it's a small hit. I mean, it's 1.8% of their salary, maxed, right? So maxed, you contributed up to the average earning at the time. So if the average earning at the time was 10,600, if you could make 15,000 a year, good for you. But you provided 1.8% on your first 10.6. Not a lot. A pretty sweet deal. Pretty sweet deal for the boomers to make sure that they had work. And then and then the greatest generation, their parents, why wouldn't they retire, right? I mean, they'd worked hard. They'd gone through World War II. Everything was tough. And somebody said, here's a quarter of your salary.
So just to be clear, the 1.8, if we round that up to 2, and then the business matches it, that's 4%. And then for 5 people times 4, that's 20%. So it's just under a quarter.
Just under a quarter. A quarter. Today, mathematically, it's exactly a quarter. I don't have the data of what they said in those days, but I can confirm today that it's a quarter. But yeah, you're probably right. It's about 20% in those days.
So, but this is all based on this model, or whatever you want to call it. It's based on a massive amount of kids being born, like a high population of young people.
Completely, absolutely. That like it, and no money saved for the future. This is a pay-as-you-go system that they call earning related, and earning related will make sense for the next generation, for the workers, for the workers 20 years down the road. But yeah, this is pay-as-you-go. So then, go ahead.
Before you go, because I want to clip this part out, just to be absolutely clear, and I know you said this. This is not pension or people paying into their pension. This is new people, new employees taking a chunk of their salary and giving it to pensioners.
Absolutely. And think of the pensioner. Look at it. Like, think of the pensioner on this chart, right? Like the pensioner in 1969, somebody who's 65 years old in 1969 he contributed the last 7 years. He contributed from 70, he contributed a little more than that. He contributed 12 years. But now after that, once he retires in 79, he's getting a pension. And he only paid somebody else's pension for a couple of years. So like the first generation of people, like the for the first 20 years of the Canada Pension Plan, those people got a sweet deal. Absolutely sweet deal.
I'm laughing my ass off. I'm just looking at this, and like 1970, 5,300 average salary goes up 100, 100, 100, 1,000. I'm like, I wonder what happened in 1974 that caused us to go up. That Pierre Elliott Trudeau
Yeah. No,
switched over the Bank of Canada. All hell broke loose.
There's definitely, once you start diving into the history like that, you see some interesting patterns. I mean, it's fascinating to see that somebody could live on a quarter of that, $2,500. Now, keep in mind, there were, and like I said, you didn't need, like, the government figured you need about 20% of your average salary as a supplement, which is better than, like, what were people gonna do if the government hadn't implemented this in 1966, right? Like, if the government hadn't implemented this, people would have continued working until they died, or they would have saved a little bit of money, or they worked for companies that already had pensions. I mean, pensions, employer funded pensions have existed since the 1950s. So there were pensions, but this was, for most people, this was who didn't expect anything. Suddenly the government in 1966 says, we're going to give you a quarter of your salary. That's pretty good, right? That's pretty good. And some of them continued working anyways. I mean, you're 65 and you can still do that today. You can collect from the government at age 65 and continue working. And in those days, I imagine a lot of people did that, because a quarter for some was not, well, anyways, it is what it is. So now bring up that chart, the timeline chart.
Can I, 2 more questions?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. It's your show.
Yeah. With your permission. The first question, if they hadn't done this, so you have a baby boomer, and then they're like, okay, we have to bring pensions to get these people to retire. Presumably, this is not the first time in human civilization where you've had a boom generation. What would have happened if they didn't do this?
We haven't had a lot of booms like we had after World War II, and the boom was dramatic in Canada more than anywhere else in the world. Like, the Americans had a boom, but proportionately, they didn't send, even though they send like 5 times as many soldiers as we did, they had 10 times the population. So we had a huge boom. And then think of countries like Japan, where it was the opposite. They wiped out an entire population. Germany, Europe, places like that, right? So they had the opposite problem. It's a good question. I don't know what would have happened. I mean, there would have been it would have been crowded, and maybe if we hadn't done this, I think maybe the economy would have actually kicked into higher gear, and we would have stayed productive, and perhaps we'd be better off if we hadn't done this. It was a lot of ideas in those days were new, and they thought about them, but not deeply. So I don't think this was deeply thought about, because this was at the very early part, right? They could have waited another 5 years to see the real effect of the boom. Yeah, it's a good question. For a historian than for me.
The reason I ask is because I always see government, they come up with reasons to justify meddling, like the interest rates and the boom bust cycle of the economy is one, the dairy cartel, or any of these cartels where they say, we have to regulate it, otherwise there's too much competition. Is that what they're trying to do here? We have to regulate it, otherwise there's too much competition, wages will fall?
No, I think they genuinely saw that there was going to be a whole bunch of kids that were going to come into the workforce and were going to be looking for work, and they needed to push out the older generation. Like the baby boom has created problems for our society ever since 1965, and it will continue for about another decade until that whole, when you look at a demographic tree, and we have a problem with the baby boom that no other country had to deal with. Other problems that go with this. I mean, we did this for them. We went through an expansion era, like we built universities, we built all sorts of infrastructure to accommodate the baby boomers that now we don't need. And we created problems. Like, this is a problem, right? The expectation of a pension is a problem. Like, nobody had this expectation prior to 1965. You worked your ass off for most of your life, and you saved modestly, and you took care of yourself. So this was introduced to solve a problem, but down the road, like 40 years later, I think it's created a lot of problems on the expectation side. The other thing is the Americans were probably doing it, or not probably, the Americans were doing something similar. So of course we have to keep pace with what the Americans are doing. And they were politicians. I mean, Diefenbaker's recognized as a great politician, but he was like anybody else. He introduced the Diefenbaker and some of the others around that era introduced social welfare like Medicare and pensions and things like that. So it's all part of that march towards more socialism and government intervention. It definitely started in the 1960s.
So I'm finally glad I met somebody who could answer what life was like before pensions. I always wondered, I'm like what did people do? And the answer is, well, they worked to death. So
they worked to
now I
death.
know.
No, it's truly what they did. They worked to death. And then we lived, like, the life expectancy of a Canadian in those years was 67 to 72 years old. Like, it's 10 years younger than what we live to today.
Okay. My other question. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I want to let you move on to the next slide. But my other question, you mentioned private pensions, like enterprise since the 50s. What's the purpose of a private pension? Is it to get people to remain loyal to the company?
Mostly. Yeah, I mean, it's long-term retention, and old pensions in the good old days. Like today, very few companies have what are used to be referred to as a defined benefit. Like, a defined benefit pension is one where you contribute your whole life, and at the end, the company takes care of you with a defined benefit. And it was a way, like, attracting and holding on to workers for long, for most of humanity was critical. And companies, that's what they did. Like, they would offer you a pension as a way to retain you. And the way they put your hooks into you is your pension. In those days, you didn't vest, right? Even today, pensions don't vest until a certain time. But in those days, they'd put a hook into you and say, if you work for us for 20 years, only after 20 years will your pension start vesting. So it hooked people big time. But it was a nice thing. I mean, my father passed away about 6-7 years ago, 2019, and Dad worked for the same company his entire life and had a pension. It's pretty sweet. Like, he was well taken care of by his employer, I'll say that.
All right. Well, what slide should I bring up?
So go to the next slide. Go to the slide with the timeline, right? So from 1966 until 1995, and one of the things in the rules in the Canada Pension Plan is that the auditor or the chief actuary of Canada is supposed to review the health of the Canada Pension Plan every 3 years. So he kept doing that all the time. And you can see there in 1995, the chief actuary of Canada found that the CPP was in danger of running out of funds in 20 years. And so go back to one of those charts, but go back to the one, say, the 1990s, the next one there's one there that's, there you go. So then you can see, what the warning signs in the 1990s were twofold. One was that we were getting, the baby boom was making its way through. The next generation wasn't as big, like not even close to as big. So I'm the next generation after the baby boomers. I'm the Gen X that started working in 1990, 88, 89, 90. We were miniature compared to the baby boomers before us. And so the ratio of workers to the next generation took a dramatic hit in the 1990s. And so immediately, and now by the 65 to 90, it doesn't appear like it, but it's already 30 years almost, right? So now you got workers that are you got baby boomers that are almost starting to retire. And you can see that there won't be enough workers for them. So the ratio won't, so the first problem is the 5-to-1 ratio is now down to 4-to-1 or 3.5-to-1. So the first solution that the government implemented was increasing the contribution rate for those young workers. So when I joined the workforce in 1990, I was paying 2.2% or 2.3%. And before that, everybody had been paying 1.8%. And look at how fast it climbs, right? Like right away, 2.3, 2.4, 3.5 a decade later. And while they're doing that, they're also increasing the basic amount to which the maximum that you can contribute. So that's the first problem the government identified, is that the ratio of workers was shrinking. And the second problem was that 20% wasn't enough for a pension. People wanted more. People kept wanting more. They wanted 25%, and the life expectancy of Canadians started going up, right? Like, so now by 1990, 95, Canadians are living to be 84. So the math that used to work, when there was 5 workers for every retiree, and you gave them a 20% pension, and the retiree died at age 75, the math worked. But by 1990, the math isn't working because there's not enough workers. People live longer, and they want a little bit more money because life's more complicated. So those are the first things that the government was doing in the 1990s, was just jacking up the rates. So by the time, that's where, that's where I was working. That's what was happening to me. And so I'll pause it there. Like, this makes sense, right? You get and this problem was predictable. But I don't know why they failed to anticipate this.
Okay, so one question: when the life expectancy of the boomers, when it increases, that's like a population increase, right? Mathematically, there's not enough people dying off, right? So that's almost like this. Let me get the other screen. This percentage contribution you need to give, as they're not dying off fast enough, and there's not enough new ones coming in. This percentage has to increase
for two folds, right? They're not dying off, and plus they're expecting a little bit more money because their lifestyle, life is more complicated for a retiree in the 1990s versus a retiree in the 1970s. Everything's more expensive, and there's less workers. So yeah, it's a big problem. The boomers created a huge problem. It's a huge problem because the life expectancy and the boomers and the fact that they had no kids was a problem, and the problem's getting even worse. We'll get to that when we get to 2024 or 2025.
Oh Lord, I don't want to see that. But one question: why did they never make this, when they originally made this in 65? Was this supposed to be temporary?
No.
Why would they not make it temporary? At least lie. That's what government does. Like, this is a temporary government program.
It would have been temporary, but then how would you convince a worker? No, it's a pyramid scheme, because then, like me as a worker, then you'd be telling me, if I was 30 years old in 1970 and you told me it was temporary, I'd be like, oh, so I'm going to contribute for my parents, but then I don't get anything for my effort when I'm ready to retire? It would, and the answer would be no. It would have been a hard pill to swallow for some, and a hard sell. And by the way, there's other solutions, there's other problems, but there's also other solutions that have been proposed, right? The initial age that was picked for retirement was 65. There was a debate in the beginning, should it be 64, 63, 65, and somebody landed on 65. To this day, 65 is an absolutely arbitrary number, right? Why do you stop working at 65? The only reason you stop, the only place in Canadian legislation where you retire at 65 is in this Canada pension plan. And it's not that you're forced to retire. It used to be the earliest that you could collect it. There's no law anywhere in Canada that says you have to stop working at 65. Still isn't. But it's generally, it was picked as the age to the minimum age that, or the minimum age that you could start collecting your pension. And now we did some weird things along the way. Like, they lowered the age that you can collect your pension to 60, which makes the problem worse. And now, if you collect at 60, you get less money, but they did lower the age at one point, and it's still the minimum. You can still start collecting at 60. Under Harper, who understood some of these problems, Harper tried to bring the minimum age back up to 67, and that got shot down because it's now become a socially a social norm, socially expected that you will retire at 65.
It's impossible to take away. It's easier to give.
Exactly. So that goes back to your original question. Could this have been a temporary program? Good luck, right? I mean, and people, it's an expectation nowadays. So now go back to that chart that shows the timeline. So in 1995, go ahead.
One thing. Like, I understand that it's hard to take away once you've given, but the whole purpose of this was temporary. Like, we have a temporary boom So we're just going to make an agreement to get these guys. Did nobody stand up and say, hey, guys, this thing is going to fall flat on its face if this generation doesn't have the same amount of babies as the previous one?
Yes, I'm sure there was. I mean, there's always people that stand up and state things like that. In fact, it's funny. I was watching Question Period yesterday, and people in Question Period in our government, every day there's people who oppose a motion, and motions are always like, there's always good arguments. That's one good thing. I mean, some days Question Period looks goofy. Question Period is goofy, but after Question Period, when you get into the real business of the House, like debating motions and things like that, I'm always impressed that people bring up the correct argument for being opposed to something. Sometimes they're just opposed for political reasons, but a lot of times people are opposed for the right reason. So yeah, I'm sure throughout history, I have books on my shelf, like Boom Bust Echo is a great book, right? Somebody wrote a book called Boom Bust Echo 20 years ago talking about the baby boom, because what he said is demographics have not fundamentally changed, right? In the book, the premise of the book is you'll grow up, you'll go to high school, you'll graduate when you're 18, you'll fall in love, you'll buy your first house, you'll sell your first house, you'll buy your second house, then you'll finally buy your dream house, you'll change your work 3 times, you'll have 4 kids. And that pattern is always the same for Canadians. The ages at which we do it change a little bit. The first kid is at 28 now instead of 26. But people who follow demographics, and the whole purpose of Boom Bust Echo was guys who were predicting if you follow demographics, here's the businesses you should get into. If you follow demographics, get out of, sell your stock in the running room because everybody's knees are shot, and buy a business for bird watching that specializes in selling high-end binoculars and books on bird watching, because you're going to make a killing because it's predictable. So demographics, people have been studying demographics and they're totally predictable. That's why the Canadian government has tables like the life expectancy tables and things like that, because policies are based on all of that. To this day, the government, if you look at the one of the things I said is the CPP rule requires that the chief actuary. So the chief actuary, an actuary is a person who predicts like life expectancy and life habits, right? They're the guys who do the insurance tables. So it's up to that guy to decide whether the Canada Pension Plan is healthy. It's not up to the parliamentary budget officer or somebody else. It's up to a very specific individual, the chief actuary. And so the last report, I think, is 2022. Go read the report of the chief actuary on the health of the Canada Pension Plan, because what does he have to do in there? He has to predict how long Canadians will live, what the birth rate will be, what the unemployment will be, what all these really crazy things. So if you want to have an idea of where the bank or where the government thinks life is going, go look at that. I always challenge people. People say, oh, interest rates are on their way up. I'm like, you think so, but the experts at the government who have all the data, they're forecasting it to go down. So we have great information. So yeah, the chief actuary, to your original question, should somebody have predicted this? Absolutely. But I've seen what happens to the poor chief actuary and the parliamentary budget officer on most days, right? They're ignored. I mean, they're nonpartisan, but they get ignored, which is frustrating.
Any smart comments in Parliament, they usually get ignored.
Totally. Yeah. So back to that quick chart. Let's just look at that quick chart. So by 1997, CPP Investment Inc. is formed. And so up until that point, the government, it's a pay-as-you-go. So the workers of the day pay for the retirees of the day, and there's no money left for the future. But up until that point, there was always a little bit of leftover money, right? So the current workers contribute, and they always had a little excess, because no matter what, a few retirees die before they hit 65. A few retirees only live 3 or 4 years after collecting. So there's a bit of money that's slowly building, but not a lot. And up until 1997, the government was managing that money by themselves. But finally, in 1997, they're like, okay, let's get some pros to manage this teeny weeny little bit of surplus money. So in 1997, they formed an organization called Canada CPP Investment Inc., which is an investment which is a big fund management group that operates at arm's length from the government. So at the end of every year, the government collects Canada Pension Plan, pays it out to the pensioners, and when they have a little bit of surplus, they put it in that fund. And that fund has been growing since 2001. So that fund finally got put into existence in 2001 and has been growing ever since. And today that fund, if you go to CPP Investment Inc., you can see that fund's worth about $630 billion. But that fund is just for a rainy day. So all the surpluses have gone into that fund for a rainy day. And recently, a couple of years ago, so the actuarial report for 2022, the one that came out just after COVID, that's the one that raised an additional alarm. Sorry, not that one. There was another one. There was a report in about 2019 that raised an additional alarm that said, even though we have this fund, actually, before the fund was set up, the one alarm was raised, which was back to those tables, right? No matter what, the ratio of workers is going down. So that was the first big alarm that got raised in the last decade, was that the ratio of workers is going down. That's not reversing. We're now at the point where it's like 2.5 workers for every retiree. So if you go to the newest chart, the last one that I got up there, that one. Look at the payment now. Like in 2024, my sons who just entered the workforce, they're paying 6% of their salary to the Canada Pension Plan, and that's still not enough. But so instead, I was at 1.8, they're at almost 6%. So that's 3 times, and that reflects the fact that the ratio of workers is down to below 3 to 1. And the retirees are living into their 82, 83, 84, and they're at 25% of their, the pension plan is 25% of what they contributed to. So, and a report around 2020, 2021 finally drew the conclusion that sometime in the near future, they said around 2030, there won't be enough money. Like they've maxed out. The idea is they can't go higher than 6%, like 7-8%. Then that's completely unfair to the workers of today. It's unsustainable, and so it's maxed out. They can't lower the contribution because the retirees have an expectation. You can't increase the age at which they withdraw it. So right now, the government knows that in 2030, it's going to start to have to dip into that fund that it's been building with the surplus money. The fund sounds big at 600 billion, but it's 600 billion. The payouts right now, you can do the math on your own, but the payouts roughly is about $60 billion a year. Like we collect about $65 billion from workers in 2024, and we're going to pay out $60 billion to pensioners and CPP recipients. So that leaves a surplus of $5 billion. Next year, there won't be a surplus, and the year after. And by 2030, it goes into a negative. So by 2030, they'll collect $70 billion from workers. They'll be paying out $80 billion. So they'll have to take $10 billion out of that fund. They keep saying that $500 billion will keep growing and that it'll be sustainable, that we won't, the system is manageable. Time will tell.
Okay, so now time for some questions. So technically, the CPP right now, it's not in a bad shape. Like every year, they're bringing in more money than they give out, and that whatever there's more, they put it in the fund.
Correct.
It's not fair to the workers because they're taking way more and more money every year, and by 2030, the workers will refuse to pay what's necessary.
Correct. Wow, yeah, that's a good way to paraphrase it. And yes, it's not fair to the workers today to have to pay 6% when previous generations paid less than that. And there's and so that's one problem. And then the other thing that's happening is workers right now are saying, and they're right to say this, workers have been correct and for the, let's say for the last 20 years, workers would have been better off to opt out and put that matching amount into their own savings plan, right? Because like, look at the amount for a worker this year. Like he's going to contribute $4,000, right? And 2024 is going to contribute 3,087. So let's say he does that for 30 years. That's that's $100,000. That's $200,000. It's plus. I've done the math on this, like, because it's going to escalate. He's going to contribute. Actually, let's not do past worker. Let's do the recent worker. A worker who is about to retire in 2024. You could add up all his max contributions and his bosses, and he contributed $175,000 in the last 30 years. And if he just invested it starting at the start of his career, and he just got an exchange traded fund on the Toronto Stock Exchange and got like 6%, he'd have $780,000 in his bank account, and he could pay himself a 10% dividend off of that, which is $78,000 a year. And he would not even chew into his principal, and he'd have that money left over to give to whoever he wants when he passes away. So the money that a worker in the last 20 years has been contributing to the Canada Pension Plan so that he can get his little pension today is wasted. Or it's not wasted, but it's way less lucrative than if he had invested it himself. And that's by design, because a lot of people won't save a lot of money and don't like. That's the other thing about the pension plan is it's there as the bare minimum for people who won't save a penny. So you're forcing people to save. But there's other tools. I mean, New Zealand has a model where you're forced to put aside whatever, the same amounts as this, 4%, 5%, 6% of your salary, but you put it into an RRSP or some other mechanism that and even if you don't want to control it, the government can control it. But this is money that you're giving to the government, and you have no recourse. Like I'm an example of that. I've almost maxed out my Canada Pension Plan contributions for the last 30 years of my life. And I go on the internet and I get a little statement, and it says, 3 years from now when I start collecting, because I'm going to pull it as soon as I'm 60, man, I want it out of there. I'm not leaving it a day longer. And I'm entitled to about $700 a month, like $14,000. And it's nothing. If I'd invested that money myself, I'd be paying myself. Oh, what's that noise? Is that me or you? No, that's you.
No, I'll mute. That's the dogs.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, what were we talking about? This is
14 grand.
Yeah, 14 grand. So it's barely sustainable. And it's not fair. It's a social program that where very ambitious people are forced to pay to subsidize people who are not saving for a rainy day.
So for me, I always thought a pension, and I was completely wrong. I thought a pension, in this case, Canada Pension Plan, is when your employer, Government of Canada, whatever, says you have to put 1% of your yearly salary away in a fund with TD Bank, and then when you retire, it's grown, and you can live off that. That to me was a pension, but this isn't that. This was like a temporary solution where they said to employees, you directly take a chunk of your salary, you pay retirees.
Yep.
And then somehow in 2001 or whenever it was, something clicked in the government. They're like, wait a minute, guys, why don't we create a fund that grows? And it's like halfway to what I originally thought a pension was.
They never wanted that. They never thought they were going to need a fund, but they really, call it 1980. By the 80s, they're starting to collect a little surplus from the workers, and they were keeping it. Luckily, they didn't just put it in the general coffers, because then it would have been gone. So at least there was something in the rules that said the surplus had to be managed by the Government of Canada, and then they turned over the surplus early on to somebody else to manage professionally. Thank God they did that, because less than a decade later, they realized, holy shit, even the surplus is actually going to be needed, because there's not enough workers and people are living too long. And now we're at the point where even the surplus might not be enough. I mean, the surplus on paper looks good. It's $600 billion. But like I said, the pension, the money, the funds necessary to fund the pension is like $70-80 billion a year. So at first, if we only take 10-20 out of that fund, that's fine. But I fear that the fund performance isn't there. And well, it isn't there because they're so doubly worried about the problem that what they created that you don't even see on that chart, there's now a CPP2. So there's an even higher hurdle for higher earners because even this and even with the fund, they're worried. Like they're not saying it out loud, but it's apparent by their actions, you know, they're worried. Why did they create a CPP2, a new tier of contribution if they weren't worried? So, and they're worried about other things. They better darn well be worried about Alberta, because if Alberta, like that $5 billion in excess contribution to the funds, it only comes from one province. It comes from Alberta, maybe a little bit from BC and a teeny wee little bit from Ontario, but there's no excess funds coming into the Canada Pension Plan from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland, or Manitoba, or Saskatchewan. So that's why the government, right? Alberta wants to pull out and create its own Alberta pension plan, and Ottawa is like really scared because if we do that, we are currently subsidizing the pensions of workers in other provinces.
So before getting to the Alberta thing, I want to talk about that. But if they were going to do this the right way, you mentioned that 700,000 if you put it in a private whatever. That's how they should have done it from the beginning, right? Like, I don't support a government pension, but if you're going to do it, you should do it the right way.
That's how industry is doing it now, right? So you talked about your definition of a pension. In industry, originally most the big companies. So my dad worked for Bayer, the makers of aspirin, Bayer. So that worked for a big company, and yeah, they took aside money from him and put it in did the same thing as the Canada Pension Plan. They pooled the money, and then they told my dad, when you retire, Marcel, here's a few bucks. And what happens is once dad died, that money is not his; it stays with Bayer, right? So they and what was Bayer counting on? They were counting on my dad not living too long and not draining contributing more than he was going to withdraw, and they were counting on good returns on their investment. Bayer got rid of their pension because Bayer and other companies saw the writing on the wall. They're like, we're not growing fast. They saw the same problems as the government. The money's not growing, and the workers are living longer, and so and that money was sitting there, and it was tempting for the companies themselves to want to touch that money. I mean, I can't tell you how many pension funds disappeared because companies went bankrupt. That was the other problem. So the companies saw some of the writing on the wall, but also smart workers saw the writing on the wall, and smart workers said, well, I'm going to contribute, but the money won't even be there. So at least so workers were able to convince companies to go away from this model. You and I should be convincing the government to go away from this model because we're smart and we know that doesn't work. But the private sector witnessed that 20 years ago, easily. And so 20 years ago in the private sector, companies started adopting what they call a defined contribution pension, which is the government, the employer would give you that 3 or 4%. The company would give it to you instead of the other way around. The company would literally. So I worked for companies in the last decade, 20 years, that would give me 2% of my salary instead of the other way around. They said, here's 2% of your salary. We're not going to put anything in the pension. Here's our 2%. You don't even have to do 2%. Here's our 2% and put it in whatever the hell you want. And then I'd sign up with a company like or an investment firm like Sun Life or whatever, and the money goes there. And Sun Life invested for me in a mutual fund. They just give me a list every year saying, of these 12 mutual funds, where do you want your 2% going into it? And so now now at close to retirement age, I got a nice little nest egg of those 2% have added up, and it's my money. It's my money. So
that that requires you to be like, you're more responsible, and if something goes south, you don't blame the company, you blame yourself, right?
You blame yourself, but and it makes people nervous. But you don't have to be an expert at doing this. If like there's plenty of variations of the model. Like, the company could say, okay, we'll take the 2% and we'll invest it for you in this other fund or this place, or create a company or whatever. Like there's variations, which is what some countries do. New Zealand does that. In New Zealand, you can do your own, and then the government does something for you. But in any case, none of them are designed to be none of them are designed to fully fund you once you retire. I mean, that's still ultimately a problem, right? Like, people think, oh, I'm going to retire and live on the exact same lifestyle. That's pretty hard to achieve. Like, you're not, like, if you work for 30 years of your life or less, and you only put 2% of your earnings aside every year, like, you haven't put a lot, right? I mean, and then if you retire for 40 years after that, whoa, you're going to have a hard time, which is a really interesting discussion. Like, when we talk about the Canada Pension Plan, I can't tell you how many people use that kind of language. Like, I can't wait to retire. And I'm like, boy, you better go look at your statement from your Canada Pension Plan, because you're going to be disappointed. Like, it's shocking. Plus, it's taxable. So you're going to collect money from the Canada Pension Plan, which is taxable, because even though it comes from the Canada Pension Plan, in the eyes of the government, it's income. So some people are paying into the Canada Pension Plan, but they're also simultaneously paying into a company pension or some other savings plan. So some lucky Canadians have too much money at the end, and ultimately they won't collect their pension plan from the Canada government.
I'm still kind of baffled by this. When was it? Whenever they set up the fund in 2001. So what was going through their heads? They're like, we're a little bit nervous. We need a little bit of buffer room. And then someone's like, well, let's not put it in a bank account. Let's put it in a fund. It just doesn't seem like they had a plan.
That's government, yes. Like, that's why create a separate arm's length organization called the Canada Pension Plan Inc. Why not just give it to they're like, the Canada Pension Plan, people say, oh, it's $500 billion, it's huge.
Okay,
it's like,
sorry, let me rephrase that. It just seems very reckless, where you're saying, hey guys, the proverbial what might hit the fan. Let's just put some money in a fund and let's go get drunk. Wouldn't they say, like, here's our business plan for once it goes in, and how we're going to pull it out, and the population projections for the future?
Yeah, they did that. And I mean, that's in those are in some of the report. The problem is identified by the chief actuary in every 3 years, and then there's an act somewhere that creates the Canada Pension Plan Inc., and the justification for that creation is in that act. I mean, you can go find it. But it's a weirdly Canadian thing to want to do everything ourselves. I mean, the government could have just said, we got surplus money every year. The projections look like this. We need to do that. They could have given the money to any of a lot of other organizations to manage it on our behalf, which is a problem right now. Actually, the Canada Pension Inc., CPP Inc., is a lousy money manager. Terrible. I mean, they got a 1% return last quarter, and the stock market gained 6%. So they're like, not everybody, but people are starting to get critical of them. It's like, you got 3,000 people managing $500 billion, and we have offices in Singapore and all over the place, but they're an arm's length of the government. That's why the government did it, right? Think about it. Why wouldn't the government not just give it to a totally private organization? Why does the government create an arm's length organization called Canada Pension Inc.?
Right.
That money's easy, man. It's right there, and it's in the balance sheet. That money is in the balance sheet. Like, when you look at the balance sheet of the Canadian government, that money is right there. So, and it's the same problem that companies do. Many companies have gone through this. Companies going bankrupt go, well, look at this. We have a $6 billion pension fund that we can use, and then the law has always said, well, no, if the company's going bankrupt, they can't touch that, and that should be held in escrow and given to somebody else. Bullshit. So and which is back to why I would have opted out of the Canada pension plan 30 years ago if I could. Probably not 30 years ago. I would have been too naive and too dumb to understand how things work. But 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I would have opted out and put the money aside for myself.
So I have a question for you. This, well, where is it?
And create yourself before you ask your create yourself a My Canada account and go look and go see what you're entitled to for your pension.
I'll go do that later today, and then I'll kick myself for not, opting out. But for now, until I start drinking, I need to be drunk to do that. But I'm just looking at this, the employer contribution. So we went from 1.8 to 2.2, 3.5, 4.95. But here, is this a driver for the immigration that we're seeing right now?
Yes, those are drivers, right? Immigration solves this. We've given ourselves these social benefits that we can't afford and can't fund. So we need people. So immigration, this is just one of the problems that gets solved by immigration. But it's not solving it very well, because immigration creates a bigger problem than it solves, I think. I mean, I'll give up my pension. I'll take $1,000 off my pension and keep the immigrants at bay and bring the cost of my house down $10,000. I gain way faster. I mean, my pension plan gains are eroded by the cost increase of my mortgage, like 5-fold, right? It's insane. So this is this is a funny one. This is a passionate one. I met people all the time, like, keep your hands off my money. No, it's not your money. There's none of it there that's yours. There's money in the Canada Pension Fund that's been contributed there since 2001, 2002. So if you're a 40-year-old worker today, sure, there's some money in there that's yours. If you're a worker that's already been retired for 5-6 years, bullshit. None of the money in there is yours. It's all somebody else's. And keep your hands off my money. You'll be surprised how little there is. And and then if you're my sons today, my sons are higher than 5.95 because I don't have the chart for it, but there's a CPP 2 that goes all the way up to about 77,000. So they contribute even more than 5.95.
Why did they do a CPP 2? Why didn't they just increase the percentage for CPP?
Because they're putting it onto the 1%.
Oh, you need to be a higher salary to qualify to pay for CPP 2?
If you're a higher salary, you pay a higher So they hate to admit it and they're hiding it, but the contributions are on a progressive scale, just like your income tax.
That's for CPP 2, not CPP.
Yeah, but it ends up being for. I mean, when I see CPP 2, I have a hard time. I have a hard time understanding. Like, I'm like, there's no such thing. Just change. Just go to the top line there, and under 25, just put that the maximum contribution is actually 77,000. Like, the difference is that the CPP 2 is not at 5.95. I think it's like at 4% or something like that. So it should show up as above a certain salary. They made a surtax or a sur contribution, and it's weirdly worded, and it's kept separate so that most people don't see it. But and in fact, it's not the 1% because it's based on the average salary. So anybody who makes over the average salary or the median wage in Canada pays a higher tiered CPP, but they still only talk about CPP 1.
So just like you said, it's a progressive pension contribution, right?
Yes. Actually, let me look it up. CPP 2. It shows up pretty quickly. Second additional. So I'm on a different screen. It's 4%. This year, it's 4% for wages above the 70 or the 67 and up to 73. So it's not. So they could have done it as a progressive. They could have done a progressive scale somehow, but it is a progressive scale, but it's just that at the higher rate, you get a lower contribution. but it's still a lot, right? So you pay 6% on the first 71,000, which is whatever, 4,000, and then you pay 4% on the next 5, which is an additional $2,000. Like, holy shit, or $200 or whatever it is. So it's an additional number. Yeah.
Marty, I always wanted to be on a beach with a stewardess in like Mexico. I did not want to be on a screen share with another guy looking at these what do you call spreadsheets.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. The numbers are there, and that's what I was going to tell you, right? So the numbers are there. I've been going through a lot of town halls in Alberta where this is discussed because it is a timely topic. There is a talk about Alberta wanting to withdraw and go its own. Alberta could go its own and leave all the CPP money aside, like all the money we've contributed, we could leave it over there and leave it to the others, even though mathematically we've contributed about 60% of the money that's in that 5 billion, 300 billion of that came from Alberta. So even though we're like 1/9 of the provinces, we contributed 60% of the money in that fund. People find that hard to believe, but it's like, it is what it is. But you can keep it. We could start our own pension, and we'd be back to where Canada was in the 1960s, because we currently have 5 workers for every retiree in Alberta, but we'll ultimately get into the same problem. But if we had to start our pension in Alberta today, I would say start it from scratch, make it a 3% contribution, and start putting surplus money right away, and trust the demographics and the forecast, and then hope for the best. So I've been talking about this a lot, and I started out by saying it's a complicated topic. I'm absolutely amazed at, I've gone where the Conservatives are promoting it and where the NDP are fighting it, and both parties are full of shit. Like the NDP don't understand it, right? Like they use the language like hands off my pension and blah blah blah. I'm like, okay, you're wrong, and it's not that much. And then you got the Conservatives going, oh, we'll do it on our own, and we'll give ourselves like these magical, like, we'll pay 75% of your salary. I'm like, oh my God, we're like, no, not even close. If it was sold as, I think it should have always been sold as not a full-time solution, but a nice little a backup, like a total fallback for people who didn't save a dime, but there are better methods than what this is, right? Like we discussed, you could do force people to put aside a few bucks in a fund that they manage or somebody else manages on their behalf. And
that's my question. Yeah. Is Alberta going to do it the right way, where you like the private industry, or are they going to do it the way they didn't see? You don't know.
Don't know. I mean, we have a board. We have a group that looks like CPP Inc. called AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, and they currently manage the pensions of civil servants. So if you're a teacher or whatever and you have a pension, they manage those pensions, and the government just fired the whole board, everybody there, and I don't know why. It looks bad. I know why. I mean, these boards, they're arm's length from the government, and they get caught up in these policies where they're investing in money losing ideas. They were investing in DEI stuff, and so there was a house cleaning. Danielle did a house cleaning at AIMCO, but we're not even talking about pensions anymore in Alberta, because Poilievre asked us not to, because he's confident he's going to win. But we're being too conservative and too fiscal in Alberta, and we're scaring the rest of Canada. So Poilievre has asked us to tone down the rhetoric. Please be less conservative, which is where you guys come in. Yeah, you guys are doing a great job. I mean, like, if you had a different leader, I'd be all over your policies. But the CPPs or the PPC is doing the right thing.
I was going to say Danielle Smith has been asked to tone it down until after the election, that she can come back swinging.
Sure, perhaps. What else were we going to talk on this topic?
I have a question for you.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, somebody said this to me. The Alberta pension plan requires a tax office. Sorry about that. Requires a tax office, and a tax office is the first step towards cessation What are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, that's part of the firewall, we call it, right? So our basically, just look at what Quebec does. Quebec has a Quebec pension plan, a QPP. They didn't opt in 1965. They went their own way, and then consequently, Quebec has its own tax collection agency, Revenu Québec. So, and look at what Quebec is able to achieve, right? They get what they want. And so that's been proposed for Alberta. It's part of the firewall. The firewall was like 5 things: our own tax collection agency, our own police force, which again Quebec and Ontario have, our own pension plan, and absolute insistence on our jurisdiction, which Danielle's kind of doing, right? Like this example of Ottawa trying to impose limits on oil production. No, that's not your jurisdiction, right? So actually, that's one thing I wanted to. It's okay. We're at the same time right now, but going on behind the scenes in the legislature today, we're invoking. There's a motion to invoke Alberta's Sovereignty Act today because of that. So when I hang up here, I'm going to go read that. We're gonna fight Ottawa's emission caps by refusing to report our emissions, which is brilliant. You don't have to do a lot. Just tell them, fuck you. We don't know what our emissions are. So how can you control us? We're not going to tell you. And and if Ottawa wants to come here and measure our emissions, we're going to say, sorry, you can't. So we're in the act, we're passing things that say we're not going to report it because it's none of your business, and you can't come and audit us. So good luck control our emissions all you want, but we're not going to tell you what the emissions are.
You should ask Ottawa to send Guilbeault to measure, and then when he arrives, arrest him.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, but it's a funny thing, right? I mean, I love, and it's weird and it's sad that we have to fight that way, but it definitely makes it interesting for political commentators like me.
So I have one final question, Marty. I'll let you go. Part of your firewall. Why is Alberta not wanting their own criminal code? Maybe that's not possible, but criminal law is
it's not possible right now. Yeah, it's not. Criminal law is absolutely one of those federal jurisdictions. So we don't need a firewall. We don't need our own criminal code right now to prevent Ottawa's overreach. We need a firewall just to defend ourselves. The firewall is maybe a step towards independence. If we ever become independent, then we'd need our own code, but it's not something that's necessary to protect ourselves right now, I guess, is the short answer.
But it has to be legal. I mean, doesn't Quebec have its own criminal code? It's civil law.
Totally different code. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point. You know what? Quebec has federal. There are some federal laws in Quebec. I mean, if you commit a murder, the civil code in Quebec is civil law for civil matters, not federal criminal matters. So, I worked with the civil code. It's a weird. Takes getting used to working in the civil code, right? They don't. It's not precedent based. The precedents sort of sit on the side when they start happening. And then when there's enough precedents, then they change the code. And so in the civil code, the judges interpret what's in the code. They really don't have a lot of leeway to interpret. And so you become masters at navigating that. I work for an oil company that got frack permits to frack wells in Quebec. And everybody always said, how the hell did you guys do that? It's like, we worked within the code, man. So if the code is there and it's a little bit cryptic, you can work within the code. And then, if it says you're allowed to drill a hole, it doesn't tell you how deep or what. So you go, well, I'm just going to go, you say, am I allowed to go deeper while I'm drilling? And the guy goes, I don't see why not. It's like, good enough. I'm going deeper. Oh, I found oil. Now what do I do? And he's like, I don't know. What is that like? You go, well, what would I do if I found gold? And the guy says, well, you'd have the rights to the gold. It's like, well, I found oil. So treat it like it's gold and I'm good. And then so the lawyers and the judges are like, son of a bitch. They give you your permit until, 3 years later, some guy goes, make sure you revise here that if they find liquid minerals. They cannot be extracted, whatever. Yeah.
Sounds more like the Middle East than Canada.
In what sense?
Oh, in the sense that you're just playing fast and loose with the law. Like, what
Yeah.
can we do? Don't worry about it. We'll deal with it if the judge complains.
Oh yeah. Well, it's not just the Middle East that's like that. I worked in the U.S. and Utah. Same thing. My career has always been oil and gas, so I drilled for oil and gas in Utah. And I remember being naive and saying, like, do we need a permit for this? And the guy's like, permit? You're in Utah, dude. Like, do what you want until somebody tells us we can't do it. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. But, you start drilling and then some guy shows up and says, what are you guys doing? We're drilling. Okay. Wow, cool. Hey, I hope so. Any other questions on the Canada? What's your overall thoughts on the Canada pension plan then? So what were you? You wanted to do this a bit as an education thing for some viewers, but what is it? Something that concerns you?
No, it's just people. They always talk about these things, but nobody really understands. Like somebody says, "Oh, the Canada pension plan is insolvent." I'm like, "What is a pension?" And they can't answer. But you answered it beautifully. It's you're taking money from new workers and you're giving it to the old ones to retire.
Yep. Yeah. And then somewhere along the way, we realized we better take a little bit more and save a little bit more for a rainy day because the demographic forecast looks bad. And the demographic forecast ended up being worse than expected because people retired earlier and lived longer. Yeah, that's the other thing that happened. Like people retired earlier. I mean, I'm an example. I stopped working when I was 57 years old. but I can't collect my pension. I can't collect it until I'm 60, and I will immediately collect it because I just want to. I don't trust the government with the money. Like if you wait, they'll tell you can collect whatever 80% of the 25% at 60. You get your 25% at 65, and then if you wait until 70, as late as 71, we'll give you like whatever 50% more. They'll give you a lot of money if you delay past if you wait until 70 to collect it. But the reality is the math is really working against you, and that's one of the things I'm very anxiously awaiting right now. Is the mortality tables are due in 3 days from now, so on November 30th, probably Monday this week. I will get the latest life expectancy tables, and I'm curious to see what's in there. Actually, weirdly, the life expectancy of Canadians has been dropping for 3 years in a row now, and it's not COVID related. Yeah, It's not COVID. It's life expectancy at birth, and we peaked out. Like the advances in medicine are offset by it's my opinion. I'd have to research it more, but advances in medicine of the last 30 years are offset by our unhealthy lifestyle, the additives in our food, all sorts of other things. Like humanity in Canada seems to have peaked out at about 82 years old.
I'm not saying this is a conspiracy, but it's in the benefit of the government if people are unhealthy and they die quicker, right?
Totally. Mathematically, absolutely. The pension plan's an example. Absolutely. Make way for it's that's getting nefarious, but it's also it's not nefarious. It's factual that the government would benefit from people dying at a younger age. Are they actively doing it? That's nefarious. I'm not sure they're not.
I think it's easier to say that they have a disincentive to keep you healthy. They have an incentive to let you continue doing what you're doing.
I think one of the factors that's being factored in these life tables is, I look at what coincidentally happened in the last 3 or 4 years to make it go down. And I think it is the assisted suicide. I think it is. Like, I think they're factoring that in. Is that nefarious? No. But it's real, right? People are choosing and saying, you know what, I'm 78 years old, everything hurts, and I'm checking out, right? And so I think that's been factored in, and that's one of the explanations for the drop in life expectancy. And
I see.
Yeah, I don't think it was done intentionally, but it's perhaps sometimes there's unintended consequences to policies, and maybe this one is an unintended consequence that they're not going to fight too hard. You know,
we've given the people that are supposed to take care of us in our old age the ability to kill us. What could go wrong?
Welcome to Canada. Hey, no, it's been a great chat, man. Maybe we should almost do one of these every 2 weeks until next year when there's an election. You know, I'm all for this. I mean, I'm totally in favor. You know, I've said it many times. Like an educated electorate is important. Like an educated voter is super important. And I've seen what you're doing, and I'm happy to lend my voice to that. Like, we need people to understand these things.
I'll leave you with this. Do you remember when you were a kid and you'd go to the doctor's office? They had the toys in the corner, like you got the square, you put the square in, and the triangle shape. Do you remember that game?
Yeah.
That's me. Just imagine me over there. I'm like, you're giving me all these shapes. You know, you're doing the hard work. I'm the loser guy over there trying to fit him in for the public. So.
I'm the guy putting him in my elastics and shooting him across the room instead of trying to. All right, bud. Good chat.
Right. Until next time. Thanks.
Cheers, everyone. Take care.
Bye.